Right, hello, welcome. Welcome to Trinity Hall's very own Hustings, because this is, as I suspect you all know, an election year. I mean, it technically could go to January next year, but I don't think any of us think that's likely. So before we get into the event and before I introduce our guest, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Just to let you all know that the event is being live streamed via Zoom, and we're also recording it. So you'll be able to watch it afterwards or send a link to friends. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions once we've had some discussion, and we'll have microphones that we can pass around. And if you're online, joining online, you can submit questions for the panel via the live chat function, and we can pick those up and have them in the discussion afterwards. So I am extremely honoured and delighted that our three panellists have been willing to come along and join the political fray in this way. First, I'm going to introduce Lee David Evans, who's here representing the Conservative Party. Lee's a historian of the party and the inaugural John Ramsden Fellow at Mile End Institute, Queen Mary, University of London, and I think focuses on the One Nation tradition of the Conservative Party, and especially interested in the post-war Conservative administrations. For over 15 years, he's been an active member or active in Conservative Party politics, supporting working for members of Parliament, organising parliamentary campaigns, and holding various roles within the voluntary party, particularly interested in regional inequality, access to education, and preserving the British Constitution. So he will speak for and represent the Conservative Party. We're then very lucky to be joined by Baroness Glenys Thornton, who will represent the Labour and Cooperative Party. She's a member of the House of Lords after a career in the voluntary, cooperative and private sectors for some decades. She was Chief Executive of the Young Foundation from 2015 to 2017. She continues as a senior fellow there, I think. She's a former government health minister and women and equalities minister, and now speaks for women and equalities and DCMS in the House of Lords. And she's chair and now patron of Social Enterprise UK and involved at the Judge Business School here in Cambridge. Sandy is here for the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats, yes, the Liberals. And when asked who is Sandy Walkington, ChatGPT says Sandy Walkington is a British politician who was a member of Parliament for St Albans. This is a healthy reminder that ChatGPT is not always to be trusted, because you did indeed try several times to become an MP in St Albans, but just didn't quite make it. Is that right? Yeah. But nonetheless has been very involved in politics and as a councillor, but has also been involved in many other roles in communications, both with the Liberal Democrats, but also other businesses and so on. So I do feel I should just say that we are mindful that there are other important political parties in this country, and particularly in the devolved nations. Great to see the Northern Ireland Assembly back up and running. Obviously in Scotland, the SNP, the largest party there, although facing some renewed challenge from Labour. And in Wales, obviously, Plaid Cymru remains important to watch. And we would notice too that the Green Party and the Reform Party in particular, I think, are going to have a bearing on the results and who wins which seats in the election in the UK as well. I think those are the introductions and the key points for us to get across. This is a political event, and therefore we want it to be lively, we want it to be robust, but we want it to be civil. And I'm here to try and make sure that we achieve that. Right, so might be May, probably the autumn. The parties have not published their manifestos yet, but we know, I think, that you're all working very hard on shaping the policies and the messages that will come to us, the electorate, to help us make our decisions. So we're going to begin. I've asked each of our guests to, in a way, make a pitch, make a manifesto or a party pitch for up to 5 minutes to really try and sell their party, their agenda to us, the voters. And we're going to start, as is usual in these debates, with the incumbent party. So please, Lee, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. What I first want to do is talk a little bit about why I think conservative values are the right values for this country. And it's particularly good to be in Trinity Hall, a college that marks its 675th anniversary next year, because that really speaks to what conservative values mean. Because to be a conservative is to believe in the merits of what has come before, to see the value of traditions, of convention, in what we already have, and not to throw it away in pursuit of utopian ideals, fanciful claims, or the delusions of politicians. And to be a conservative is to believe that the fundamental job of government is neither to create nor to destroy, but to improve, and to try and leave a country that is recognizably the same, but better, for the next generation that comes. And that brings me on to my second point, that is what the conservative values have done for this country. Let's look at some facts from the last 14 years. So since 2010, there were 4 million more people in this country with jobs than when we first came into office. We've nearly doubled the personal allowance. We've introduced a national living wage, which will be £11.44 this year. By the way, when we first came into office, the minimum wage was less than £6. We've lifted more than 250,000 pensioners out of poverty through the triple lock. And it doesn't stop there. When you look at education, when we first came into office in 2010, 68% of schools in England and Wales were good or outstanding. Today, that's 88%. And if you can find me a teacher who thinks that Ofsted inspections have got easier in the last 14 years, and well, I'll eat my hat because they haven't. But our schools have got better. If you look at the OECD, I had to write this bit down. If you look at the OECD PISA rankings, under the last Labour government, we were 27th in maths. Now we're 11th. We were 25th in reading, and now we're 13th. And when Labour were last in office, we were ranked 16th in science, and now we're up to 13th. All delivered under a Conservative government that's put 27,000 more teachers in classrooms since 2010. And finally, because I'm conscious of time, I want to talk a bit about the climate, arguably the gravest issue that we face. So under the Conservatives, and you may have seen, Britain is the first G20 country to halve its carbon emissions. Renewable fuel now counts for almost 40% of our electricity production. It was just 7% when we came into office. And the UK boasts 5 of the world's largest offshore wind farms, all here on the coast of the United Kingdom. So if you scratch behind the politicking, and we've heard lots of that, I'm sure we'll hear lots of that again tonight, you see a country that is slowly, but surely, moving in the right direction. And I'll be the first to admit, and I dare say some of you may agree, that we've not been a perfect party of government, and we're not a perfect party at all. But whatever the merits or faults of the Conservative Party and this government, the next election isn't just a referendum on us. It's a choice between competing visions for the country. And so that brings on to my third point, that neither of the other two major parties deserve your vote. Let's start with Keir Starmer. So Keir Starmer was, of course, the champion of a second referendum, until he wasn't. He was Corbyn's loyal lieutenant in the shadow cabinet, until he kicked Corbyn out of the Labour Party altogether. He was the left-wing candidate for leader of his party, until he ditched every pledge that he had made. You might have seen he ditched another one today. In the 4 years that Keir Starmer has been leader of his party, we've heard next to nothing about his vision for the country. And so it makes it all but impossible to know which Keir Starmer you would get as Prime Minister, all but impossible to know which Labour values you would get from a Labour government. And it makes it all but impossible to make an informed choice for the Labour Party.
Know which Prime Minister we'd get.
It makes it all but impossible to make an informed choice for the Labour Party at the next election. And then we come on finally to the Lib Dems. Now, talking about the Lib Dems as a Conservative is a bit like, it's like bumping into an old school friend, somebody you knew really well for 5 years, but now they sort of deny ever having known you at all and keep slagging you off behind your back. But you can know everything you need to know about the Lib Dems by knowing that Nick Clegg stood in this college and pledged to vote against any rise in tuition fees, and then voted to triple them in government. And it's the Lib Dem story up and down the country. They're YIMBYs if you want them to be, but they'll be NIMBYs if you prefer. They're the anti-Tory party if that's what it takes to win your vote. But they're the anti-Labour Party, if that's what's required. And actually, the Spectator magazine got this right in the early 1960s. They said the Liberals were the aimless, all-purpose, wish fulfillment machine of British politics. Because like Labour, they're not a party of principle, they're a party of their own political advantage. And that is why, to sum up, neither of these parties will tell you what it is that they would do in government. Neither of these parties will tell you what it is actually that they believe in. And that is why I think neither of these parties deserve your support. And as and when the general election comes, at some point in the next 11 months, that's why I hope you'll vote to re-elect Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives instead. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much. So we'll have a chance to challenge each of the speakers, but we're just going to let them have their say first of all. So may we turn to Glenys and Labour?
I'm going to stand up if that's
Please
all right,
do,
because
yeah.
Actually, I think when you're, it's a mark of respect for your audience, apart from anything else, when you're doing a hustings. I think the first thing I would say in challenging from my friend from the, I just want to make you know that I do realise that I am an incomer from the LSE. I am not from this college, and I'm trying very hard not to feel, you know, alone coming from the LSE. And it is actually a great pleasure to be back here. I was here about a year ago talking to in this room about social enterprises and cooperatives, which is a great pleasure. I would say that the idea that somehow or other parties that are not the Conservative Party have fanciful claims. Well, the fanciful claims, of course, that the Labour Party has are things like the things that created the National Health Service and the National Minimum Wage and Sure Start centres and all of the things that the Labour Party has done over many, many decades. And the idea that somehow this country may be, at least you modestly said, slowly improving. Actually, the next generation, I apologise for this, but you will be poorer than the one that went before. And you will be poorer than the one that went before because of the policies of the last 14 years of this Conservative government. And that's the challenge that we have in the Labour Party. So that's why we are talking about a decade of national renewal. And those three words are all important. A decade because we know that it's going to take longer than one term in politics. National because we think we want to include everybody, it's inclusive. And renewal because we know that change is needed, and it's also change that needs to be linked with hope. So that's why over the last few years, and I think it might be useful just to talk about the journey that we've been on in the Labour Party, because 2019, when we had several years of having what turned out to be a disastrous leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, there's absolutely no question about that at all. But we're not the only party that chooses, leaders that don't always serve you very well. I don't want to sort of press too much on the grief that you've had in the last few years. But the 2019 election for us was the worst election that we've had since 1935. And we knew we had a mountain to climb. And lots of people thought we would not be election ready for at least 2 generations. It could be 2 elections. But in fact, because of Keir Starmer's leadership and the leadership of the people around him, and I include myself in that, we had to spend at least a year or so sorting ourselves out. We had to deal with the poison of anti-Semitism that the Jeremy Corbyn years allowed to happen in the Labour Party. We had to change as a party. So that's what we had to do for the first period. And then we had to start looking outside to say and listen to people about their lives and what the policies were that they would need, that we would need to develop to become a government. And that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years. So the idea that we've not got policies, I can tell you, we've got policies coming out of our ears. You just go and look at our website. There is a lot of policy there about all sorts of different areas of life. But we narrowed those down to the 5 pillars, the 5 missions that I always have to look them up because I always miss one out. I always forget which one it is that, and that's the 5 things that we want to do and that we will do in government. We know that we are going to face a huge financial problem, a huge financial challenge. So we've got to get Britain building. That's the first one. Build homes, build wind farms, and invest in businesses and grow confidence with the business community. We know we have to deal with energy. We know we have to deal with clean energy, and we have committed to creating a publicly owned energy company. We know we've got to get the NHS back on its feet again, and indeed we do have plans to do that. And you know, in 1997, when the Labour government was elected then, under Tony Blair, you had a wait of 18 months if you needed a hip replacement. We got it down in the time that we had a Labour government to 18 weeks. That's just one example. And all of those waiting lists came down during that period. So we know we can do it. We've got to take back our streets. We've got to make our streets safe. We've got to deal with fly tippers. We have to deal with drug gangs. We've got to deal with antisocial behaviour. Again, we had to deal with that the last time we came into government. And we've also got to break down barriers to opportunity. That's about education. That's about giving opportunity to children wherever they come from, whatever background they come from, so that they can thrive and reach the level of attainment that they are possible of. So those are our 5 planks. And at the moment, I'll just finish on this, all of us who are working in the Labour teams, and I'm working in the Department of Culture and Media and Sports team, we have to put into the leader's office our manifesto pledges this week, actually, this week. Our deadline is actually tomorrow. And then in a month's time, we've got to put in what we think we would do within the first year, the first 100 days, the first year, so if we get into government. Some of those things obviously are speculative because we haven't seen the books. We don't know to a certain extent what we're going to find when we're there. But we are working very hard indeed to ensure that we are ready to step, because as you know, the British Constitution, the election is like a steel door. The people who've lost are out, and 24 hours later, the people who've won are in, and you walk into whatever department that you are going to be in, and you're expected to be in charge of that and get on with it. So you need to know what you're going to do and what your priorities are, and that's what we're working on right now. So I think you can trust. I think what we've done in the last 4 years since that terrible election, we have developed trust, I think, and Keir Starmer can be trusted. Keir Starmer is a working class person who got himself to university, whose mum was a nurse and whose dad was a toolmaker. He is not a privileged person. He absolutely understands the challenges that families face in this country. And he is absolutely committed to having the policies, which is why we change them from time to time, as any sensible party would and as others have. And we will be making an offer which I think will turn this country round.
Thank you very much, Glenys. Thank you very much. Right, Sandy, Liberal Democrats.
Yes, I might stand as well, because I agree with Glenys that actually it is easier to speak when you do so. I was going to start, and I wrote on a note, apologise. And I'm going to start with a deep apology to all of you because of our failure as a political class. And that, you know, when I was a student, and I was here, and it's funny standing here because, you know, I came into this place over 50 years ago, and we were revolting. And I'm just a bit amazed that you're not more revolting. And we would demonstrate at a, you know, we would demonstrate at the drop of a hat, you know, London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, we will fight and we will win. And there we are. The former master is waving his fist there. He was there. Exactly. And you know, you are inheriting an absolute pile of poo because of the failure of politics in this country. Now, my party, sadly, has struggled and only just got a handhold into power and did some good things and some bad things, or supported some bad things, but nevertheless, we're all part of it. And you are inheriting that, and you have got far more right to protest than we ever had. Nobody mentioned Brexit. Did you notice? Not a single mention of Brexit. You know, the biggest catastrophe that this country has done, I mean, a self-inflicted wound because of a whole basket of lies that were told. Climate change. We're barely touching the surface in terms of what needs to be done. If we're actually, I'm all right, I'm going to be dead. Glynis is going to be dead. The Master is going to be dead. He'll be alive. You'll be alive, you know, and you'll be sitting, why didn't they do more? Why didn't they? And then the whole nervous collapse of our country. I'm a councillor, I'm a county councillor, the 5th biggest local authority in Britain, Hertfordshire, and we just see, you know, what is happening to our services. We struggle. We have to scrutinise health, and we see what's happening to our health services. So that's my apology. Now, I used to love talking to students, and I would do it a lot. I'm now, unfortunately, regarded as past it, so I was enormously pleased to be invited to do this. And, you know, what is liberalism? And I used to say it's about freedom, fairness, green, international. Now, freedom and fairness, liberty, equality, we can debate that till the cows come home, but there's obviously a lot there. And indeed, fraternity is a word. Liberty, equality, fraternity. We don't talk enough about fraternity. And I think, and I represent one of the largest former council estates in Hertfordshire, quite a deprived population, a very ethnically mixed population. Actually, the word I would use there is sorority. And the women are just extraordinary. And they're the people that power it. And there's a sort of energy there. And I would love to harness that on a broader spectrum. But let's go to green. And the Liberal Party, which I first joined in 1972, was the world's first green party. It was the first party anywhere in the world, doesn't records show this, to actually debate the issue of the environment. It wasn't climate change then, it was pollution. And the sheer damage that was being done because economic growth meant coal being burnt, it meant oil being burnt, it meant stuff being chopped down. And we were the first party to debate it. And I took part in that debate. It was at the Southport Assembly, as it was quaintly called at that time. And when we were in government in the coalition, it's very sweet of Lee to talk about the fact that the country has led the way on decarbonisation. That was us. And it was us against the Conservatives. And it was first of all Chris Hoon and then Ed Davey who forced through getting wind power, forced through contracts. And I remember Ed, as Secretary of State, meeting me as a parliamentary candidate and a number of us, and talking about the fact that he had deliberately, because he could see that the Lib Dems are heading for a smash and not going to be in government anymore, he deliberately set up the contracts so they couldn't be broken. Because there was David Cameron going round saying, what's all this green rubbish? You know, why are we worrying about this green stuff? And he knew that they would try and break the contracts. And indeed, after we left government, George Osborne rushed round and said, can we cancel these contracts? And the civil servant said smugly, that would be very courageous, Chancellor, and it will cost you more than keeping them. And now, of course, what's happened, we are now boasting about the fact, and he's boasting about the fact, that we have decarbonised more than any other G7 country. That's a Lib Dem achievement, you know, but nevertheless, is it far enough? No, it's not. But by the way, as well, David Cameron boasts about gay marriage. It wasn't David Cameron, it was Lynn Featherstone, Lib Dem minister, who pushed that through. And the sad thing is, she'd have loved to have had heterosexual civil partnerships as well. It's quite bizarre. Gay people have got more rights than heterosexual people. And she wanted that. And Theresa May, as her Home Secretary, ruled it out. But it was Lynn that pushed that through. Lib Dem achievement. You want me to wind up, don't you? So, I will just very quickly say, international. You know, we were the first party to support the EU. I've been passionate about it forever. You look at Charles Kennedy, he was the one politician to be courageous to oppose the Iraq War, jeered at and sneered at by the Labour and Conservative MPs. I think now Layla Moran, you look at her, she is the politician who is talking with most empathy and most interestingly about what is happening in Gaza. Again, a Lib Dem. There were two Lib Dem MPs in Cambridge this century, David Howarth and Julian Huppert. There's a splendid candidate, Cheney Payne, and I do urge you to vote for her when the election comes. Thank you very much.
Very good, very good. Thank you all very much. Now, I'm going to let you each have about 2 sentences to come back to one or another about something where you feel you have been criticised and need to defend it, or need to get a point across that you didn't make because of what you've heard. So, Lee.
2 sentences. The first thing I'd say is when it comes to the general election, whenever it happens, demand facts of the people who are asking for your vote. I know you have a smart audience, but I tried to give you as many facts as I could about our record. And then we went to feelings and we went to vibes, but demand facts. And the second thing that I would say is that, sure, the Lib Dems did do a lot on the climate in that coalition, but they also blocked nuclear power and pushed against nuclear power. And if we want to get to net zero in a timely way, we need to have a full diversity of achieving our climate goals. And the Lib Dems were a barrier to that as much as an encouragement.
May I just chip in there? By the way, you're
This
totally
is
right.
your 2 sentences.
So,
Yeah.
2 sentences. I mean, Lee is right. I mean, when I was reselected, I was a Liberal candidate back when I was small. And in my first election in 1983, I got more votes than Mrs. Thatcher. And she became Prime Minister, and here am I in front of you. But she's dead and I'm alive, so probably I may have won. But no, he is quite correct. I was asked, are there any Liberal policies that you disagree with? And one was, yes, I said it's utterly stupid. We should be agreeing to a new generation of civil nuclear power, and it is part of any mix if we want to decarbonise. And I'm just completely passionate about the fact that the quicker we get to a carbon-free world, the better off you all are going to be.
Thank you.
Well, I would 2 things. One is Shirley Williams was a member of the House of Lords, and she helped to deliver the worst NHS reform that we have ever seen in 2012 and 13, and she didn't have to. I was the Shadow Health Minister, and I thought we had got a deal that we would overturn the competition rules that the Conservative government wanted to put into our NHS, and she caved. And you know what? That's what Liberal Democrats do. To my colleague here, I just say Boris Johnson, Partygate. That's all I would say.
Right, so it's good to see that attack politics is alive and well, and even the Trinity Hall lecture. But I want to put a different challenge to all of you, which is this. I think that the GDP, the national wealth of this country is something like £2 trillion. I mean, it's unimaginable, it's absolutely vast. But when it comes down to thinking about the actual money it would take to put behind the policies that you all talk about, it's in billions. I mean, I know it sounds a lot when you say this will cost $1 billion or $5 billion or whatever, but compared to the overall wealth, it's actually nothing. How different actually are you all? I mean, we know that, the constraints are there financially. You've all said you'd be fiscally responsible. So we know that you're going to play with the same essential pot of money, and you're going to tweak a bit of this, that, there. So my next challenge to all of you is to really articulate why you really are distinct and different to each other. What's the kind of core thing? And not so much about, just values, but looking forward, policy terms, where will you really make a difference to people's lives? Glenys.
It's about choices. Because we know that when and if we get, and we are not complacent, I have to say that. We have to say, we are not complacent, but if we win the next election, it's not that there's going to be no money. It's the choices you make about what you do with that money. And so I think the things that would distinguish, and you're right, therefore the overall, some of this is not enormous amounts of money, it's quite small amounts of money. So, it shouldn't take a young footballer called Rashford to persuade a government to provide free school meals for children during the summer. I mean, it just shouldn't. And that's not very much money. And that's the sort of choice that you can make when you're in government, which is why it's so horrible being in opposition. And so what you invest and do with the billions that you've got is very important. And so the principles that we will bring to bear to those choices are not, which I think differentiates us from the Conservative Party. It's not always about competition. You don't always have to have a competition to decide who you're going to give a contract to. You can actually do things by cooperation and agreement, and in fact use different business forms, social enterprises, cooperatives, mutuals, to deliver public services, for example. So you have, at the moment, I'll just use this as the final example, there are hundreds of millions of pounds being spent, very badly indeed, on those poor children that need to actually be in care, that need to be not living at home, but be in residential care. They are being run by private organisations who charge local authorities tens of thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands of pounds to keep those children in care. It's often very bad, very poor quality care, nowhere near their homes, and those children fare very badly indeed. And the profits that those companies take from that delivery of care is huge. That's a choice we can make. You can actually provide that care in a different way. You can provide it through an organisation that is not paying shareholders, for example. So it's the values that you bring to the choices that you make that make Labour different.
Sandy, give us an example of something, concrete that would make a specific difference to people if the Lib Dems are in charge.
Well,
or contributing to a hung parliament, let's say. Coalition.
Two things. I mean, first of all, as I say, the B word that dare not speak its name. But I mean, Brexit, if what it is about is that we need to increase the capacity of our economy and country to fund good public services, indeed what Glenys was talking about. And this self-inflicted wound of
so what are you going to do?
choosing. So the Lib Dems are the party that is clearly articulating that, first of all, we have to get ourselves back into the single market, and then a long-term aim of getting back into the EU, which I think will be different. It won't be like the EU is now. I think we'll see a series of concentric rings, and it'll be Keir Starmer hugging Mr. Orban in some kind of outer ring, but nevertheless, we'll be somewhere in that outer ring, and that is better than being wholly outside. And I was at a meeting last week with some truly horrific figures about what's happened to trade, and particularly services, and that's what we do services. And then the other thing, that we have to get our tax base anyway more coherent. I mean, for a start, the fact that the Queen pays less council tax on Buckingham Palace than a 3-bedroom semi up in Blackpool, I mean, there is something really weird about that. And then the fact that if you work hard,
yes.
If you work hard, then you pay X tax. If you don't work at all and just get capital gains or inheritance, you pay almost no tax at all. I mean, that's crazy. So there has to be a way of making that more sensible, and that will generate money.
Okay, so Lee, something concrete, specific, make a difference to people's lives that differentiates you from the others.
Well, I'm reminded a little bit just by being back here of when I was an undergraduate and it was 2010 and the coalition had just come in. Austerity was the political buzzword. People were occupying the Senate House. It felt febrile. And it was all because of fears about the reduction of the size of the state. And that's what we've seen over the recent years, particularly post-COVID, is that the state has got bigger. The tax burden's got larger. And that's the distinctive offer that I think the Conservative Party will have going into the next election. And we may see it in the budget when that comes up on the 6th of March. I'm pretty sure we'll see it in the manifesto, that there will be an agenda of tax cuts from the Conservatives for the next Parliament. A second very quick thing that we'll do is I happen to think political debate in the last 8 years has been pretty miserable. And that the B word, let's say, has cursed our politics to a very large degree. Now, neither of the two major parties think that we should go back into the European Union. And so the other thing that the Conservative Party will certainly do, and I'd hope Labour would join as well, is not rehash every argument, every debate as the Liberal Democrats want to do about the last 8 years of whether we should be in or out of the EU, or whether or not, what our relationship with the EU should be. It's in Britain's hands, it's in voters' hands, it's in our politicians' hands, the sort of country that we are. And redoing all of those arguments is pretty peripheral to the debate.
Thank you very much. Let's do a couple of policy areas, both of which have been mentioned, but let's go into a bit more detail here. So, the NHS. We all know huge challenges, waiting lists longer than ever, huge budget, but more and more money doesn't necessarily always seem to make things better. You know, the Lib Dems have a real focus on talking about social care. Labour's interested in prevention, community-based care. Conservatives, you know, some real focus on waiting lists and partnerships. But my question is, are any of you really being honest with the public about the scale of the challenge, the financial challenge, but maybe also the structural challenge of the NHS? You know, all of you say you're going to make the NHS better and it's sacrosanct, but are you actually really being honest about the size of the challenges?
I think we are. I mean, we know that there are 8 million people on waiting lists. And we know that the Conservative government, and I have to say, I still bear the scars from this, which is the last health bill that I did as a Shadow Health Minister, refused point blank to have a workforce plan, a long-term workforce plan. They've actually had to come round to having one now. It's not a very good one, but they had to come round to it. They refused a few years ago, absolutely wouldn't do it. You cannot take the NHS forward without a sensible and fully comprehensive workforce plan that also covers social care. So our plans are about how you grow our social care sector, because if you don't grow the social care sector, and that means devolving power to local government and giving them the resources to be able to develop social care that works and that's integrated into our healthcare service. And that means that people aren't in hospitals. I am the non-executive director of the Whittington Hospital. When I went
in North London.
In North London, big general hospital. It's a fabulous hospital. I went in the other week to see how we were getting on with accidents and emergency, and I went into the control room. That covers the 5 big hospitals in North London, and we didn't have a single bed in any of those 5 hospitals for people who were coming in through our accidents and emergency departments. And in our hospital, we had 67 beds that had people in them that could be discharged, but weren't being discharged because the social care delivery in the surrounding boroughs was not adequate to support them at home to be discharged from hospital. That is ridiculous. We do have a plan. And it starts there, it starts very local, and it really needs, it needs to be looked at. And this government has not really recognised that that's what you have to do.
Lee, being honest?
I think, well, big picture, honestly, we have, I think, 3 major issues really with healthcare. The first is that we can treat much more than the founders of the NHS ever realised that we could. Secondly, that those treatments often cost a huge amount more than anyone could have ever anticipated. And the third one is that we've got a rapidly ageing population that's got more chronic issues, and that will, generally speaking, and it's a nice thing because our grandparents and others are all living, touch wood, all of us are living much longer. So it's a nice problem to have, but it's a huge problem in terms of the cost base of the National Health Service. The challenge is in overcoming that are huge, because we look compared to where we were a couple of decades ago, and the percentage of GDP that's being spent on healthcare is going up and up and up. And the question is that sustainable, or do we have to try and find often unglamorous but innovative ways of dealing with healthcare as a country? And I think that's what we've begun to see from the government. You may have seen it's a really unglamorous thing, and hopefully it doesn't affect many of us, but the government announced something called Pharmacy First the other week. And there are now 7 pretty common conditions, shingles, whatever, that in the past you would have needed to go to your GP in order to get treatment for. You can now do it at a pharmacy. That will free up appointments. The goal is to try and free up about 250,000 GP appointments a month to begin getting the waiting list down. It's hard, it's a slog. It isn't easy because of those underlying pressures, but I think they're the sort of unglamorous things that governments need to be laser-like focused on, including social care, as was of course just mentioned then, if we're really going to have an NHS that people can rely on throughout their lives.
Thank you. Sandy, what would you point to?
Well, I'd just like to start by saying that we're the victims of history here, because Queen Elizabeth I passed the Poor Laws, and that became the responsibility of parishes. And so guess what? Social care is now the responsibility of local authorities. And then Aneurin Bevan took the work of William Beveridge, a Liberal MP, by the way, Liberal MP for Berwick-on-Tweed, and he founded a National Health Service. and that was government. So you had these two things that should be one running separately, and of course governments think they can blame the councils for inadequacies, so they always starve the social care sector. And as a local councillor, I get told all the time how our care workers are being poached by the NHS, and good for the NHS, because we can't keep up. We can't afford to keep up in terms of pay and salaries. So actually getting those two services united is key, and making sure that the pay is right is key. But then the other shocking thing, I sit on a panel looking at public health, which is now a council responsibility, but it's entirely funded by government. It's a pass-through grant. And the grant for public health has dropped by 25% since 2016, 25% less. And then we got this week this appalling report about the state of health of our 0 to 5-year-olds in this country, obesity, terrible dental conditions. And these are people who are going to come through the system and be ill and then move on and have all the issues with diabetes and cost us a fortune. So we've got to do something about the front end and getting that right. And it won't be turned around in a sixpence. It's actually thinking carefully, funding properly, and then accepting this is going to be a slow burn activity to turn the supertanker around.
On public health front, that is absolutely correct. And it really is worse than that, because I think the COVID inquiry will show that because our public health services have been so starved of funding in the years before the pandemic, those very expert public health workers were not able to do their job to help to do the preventative work you need to do when you've got a pandemic.
Climate. Now, we could absolutely get into who's backtracking most, whether it's Labour and today's announcement about the 28 billion, or Rishi Sunak saying that actually we've got longer to get rid of our polluting cars or so on. So I really don't want to go back on that. But I would like to know, again, realistically and honestly, why your party might actually help the world stick at 1.5 degrees. Again, as briefly as you can, please. Lee, why the Conservative Party on this?
Pragmatism. There's a really tempting thing for Western governments to do on the climate, and it's to basically to offshore their carbon emissions. And so if you take something like steel production, something we want to keep on doing in this country, we basically have a choice. We can either buy coal from China or from other parts of the world where we don't oversee or regulate how that's produced and how that's then shipped over to here. Or we can be more pragmatic about it and do, for example, as the government's planning to do, and have a particular coal mine in Cumbria where we know it's clean in the way it's being dug out of the ground, we know it's providing good quality jobs, it's helping level up a part of the country that's easily left behind. And so the Conservative pitch on the climate, I think, is that we'll do the difficult things, we'll also do the pragmatic things, and not simply follow a soundbite just because it sounds good or looks good in that press round.
Sandy?
Well, I mean, you saw that I concentrated on this in my opening remarks. I think we stand by our record. And if you look at Lib Dem councils around the country, they're consistently top of the league on environmental measures, whether promoting recycling or looking at decarbonising their buildings and insulating buildings and solar panels. They're always top of the league. And going back to Ed Davey, and I mentioned him in decarbonisation, but actually he played a crucial role in the run-up to the Paris Climate Accord, because because we were then part of the EU, the other EU ministers recognised that Ed knew more about this issue than any of them, so they said, you speak for the EU. So he did, and the issue was, this is preparatory work, what they call the Sherpa stuff, the issue was getting the Chinese and the Americans on the same page and both being willing to sign up to some kind of limit. And they weren't talking to one another. So basically, Washington talked to Ed, and Ed went and talked to Beijing, and Beijing talked to Ed, and he went back, and as a result, they got this understanding that they would sign up to something. By the time Paris happened, of course, Ed was out of government, but he'd done the basic hard work, and people should be actually realizing what an incredible contribution that was. It's in our DNA. You know, I joined Survival, which was the name for Friends of the Earth at Cambridge when I was here. And indeed, the chairman was Richard Brown, who went on to chair Eurostar, and he was a graduate of this college. And I joined the Liberals partly for the same reason, because it was the only party talking about these issues. It's actually there.
Okay, and
and by the way, he's quite right about Ed Davey. And this is the sort of positive thing, that each of our parties have people who are passionate about this and who have done some really excellent work in this area. And that, I think, that makes me feel sort of a bit more optimistic about where we might go as a country, because there are people who, I can't remember the name of the guy who led the Glasgow, the Conservative.
Alok Sharma.
Yeah, I mean, he really was excellent. He really was excellent. So that gives me, and I think it's important to say that there is actually quite a lot of we agree about a lot more on the green front than we would disagree about. We agree with the Conservative Party about nuclear power, for example, and the role that it needs to play in this. But of course, I will not duck the fact that just before I came here, I listened to the news to hear what Keir Starmer had actually said about the 28 billion, and why we have adjusted that figure. And we've adjusted that figure for some very simple reason, in that 3 or 4 years ago we thought that was a viable thing to do, but looking at the financial conditions of the government, that we are in, because of the way the government has conducted itself, particularly the way that Liz Truss managed to crash things, it's not going to be possible to do that every year. However, the plans and the values about what we want to achieve have not changed. They will just take longer, and they will take longer. And I think almost the first thing I said tonight was that we're looking at a 10-year plan. We do not think that we can deliver the renewal of this country. So, and I also think that we need to recognise that we are lagging. We are beginning to lag behind in some of the investment in the green agenda, and that we do need to pay attention to that. And we also need to we see this as part of revitalising the economy, creating jobs, insulating homes, and doing all of those things. And that is where we will be going, and that's what we will be doing.
great. I'm going to come to you all for questions in just a second. A few minutes later, I'm going to talk to our panellists about their personal journey and commitment to politics. But I think we should stick with the policies and the debate at this point. So we've got a couple of microphones, so please put your hand up and then we'll get a microphone to you and keep the discussion going. So we've got a young woman here.
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you. So as a doctor in public health, I would completely second the points around public health, but I'd actually like to return probably mostly to Lee and what you called vibes, or when you were speaking about it in relation to yourself, values. I think one of the points you sold that the Conservatives offer is one would know what one was getting, and it was a continuation of British values. And I suppose for me, that's not what I'm seeing currently in relation to immigration policy. I find in relation to Rwanda, it's confused and seems inconsistent within the party. But more seriously for me, it seems a real straying from what I consider British values, which is respecting people who have come to our shores in multiple different ways, served in our military, served in our NHS. And I think the hostile environment around immigration and the current income thresholds are for me not a continuation of the values that I think I would like to see. So it would be helpful to clarify on that.
Thank you. Lee.
Sure, we're very happy to talk about the immigration point for sure. So I think on immigration, it's of course worth distinguishing between two things. People who come here legally, people who come here illegally. And obviously the Rwanda policy that the government's putting through the parliament at the moment is about dealing with illegal immigration. And I think we do have to start the debate on that by recognising that tens of thousands of people currently land on the Kent coast every year in the country, usually having paid people smugglers, having come through safe countries, and it's an unsafe and unsustainable thing for our country to tolerate. And so that's why the government takes a particular approach on that. And of course, some people don't think the values are correct. That's the debate, and that's what we'll hear in the Lords and when it goes back to the Commons, I'm sure. But it's also worth, of course, distinguishing between that and legal immigration, where the interesting thing becomes that, of course, since the B word, we took back into the UK politics control over what the rules about immigration were. And the consequence of that ended up being, of course, that immigration rules became more flexible, and that the number of people coming into the country net increased in the last couple of years since we left the European Union and since the UK government focused on its own immigration policies. The challenge with that is that the polling is overwhelming that the British public think immigration is too high and has to be reduced. The government takes a view that for the sake of infrastructure and for the sake of providing basically a sustainable housing supply, etc., that the immigration levels are currently too high. And so the government has to find, and I think we will find, compassionate and reasonable ways to reduce the levels of legal immigration, whilst being respectful of the people who come to this country for all the reasons that you say, and for all the reasons, not do all of the things as you've explained, work in our NHS, work in social care, work in all manner of jobs on which the country benefits.
Thank you very much. You can have a very quick word on immigration because it's a very important political topic in this election.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, it's absolute rubbish what Lee has just said, that we couldn't have lots more people coming in from elsewhere in the world while we were members of the EU. We had that total choice. We could do that. That was our right. So it's nonsense to say that it's only because of Brexit that we've been allowed to have more people come in.
Yeah. 10 seconds. We could, but we didn't, including when his party was in government for 5 years. That's the reality of it.
Well, we start Rwanda next week in the House of Lords, and it is such phenomenal waste of money. It is such a gimmick. And we know already that if you invest the money in better relationships across the European Union and cooperating across the European Union, and we know that the money that's being invested in and being used with the French border police actually is already reducing the number of people who are trying to cross illegally. Ooh. So it's a gimmick. And it was a gimmick born by Boris Johnson when he was a bit stuck at some point a few years ago. And it's a gimmick, and it's shocking, really. And when our courts say, our highest courts say, this is not a safe place to send people to, passing an Act of Parliament which says it is a safe place to send people to does not make it so. And I think the legal and they're called Noble and Legals are our lawyers. They're going to have they're going to say that. Of course they're going to say that because that's our job in the House of Lords.
Thank you very much. There was a question here in the front.
Cheers, thanks very much. Really interesting discussion. I'm going to ask a local flavour question. Sorry, Glenys, coming in. So last year, Michael Gove announced quite significant housing increase to Greater Cambridge as part of the Cambridge 2040 plan. I'd be interested, each political party setting out your stall, do you think it's a good plan? What's your vision for the Cambridge region for next 30 or 20 years? And how does it fit into your broader kind of housing vision, I suppose?
Actually, I'm a great fan of your local MP, Daniel. I think, and I know that he is a great advocate for the city and for the hub. And I actually did do work in Cambridge before I joined the government. So I think that Cambridge has a very, very, very important role to play in our economy and science and so on.
And do you all see it as one of the places in the country that would be an appropriate one for an expansion of housing? Because that's what the proposals really are, that this might be up for really big growth.
So personally, I do. I think we have to balance two really big issues there. One of them is that as a country we have a productivity challenge. Our productivity is far too low, and Cambridge is a hyper-productive area. So there's a temptation, therefore, to put more jobs and more housing in Cambridge. But we're also a very unequal country geographically. And Cambridge is also a very rich place compared to lots of the country. So then there's also the challenge instead to put investment and to build houses in less wealthy parts of the country to try and generate economic activity. Mm-hmm. Each of those issues, I think, has to be taken on face value a lot of the time Sometimes it's an either or, sometimes it's a yes and. But certainly I think Cambridge has enormous opportunity, and I think this looks like it's a good part of its future.
Sally?
I'm not familiar with the detail, I'm
No.
afraid. I now live in Hertfordshire, so I hesitate to comment about the detail of the South Cambridgeshire plan. All I know is that Cambridge was quite a small place, and it seems to be breaking to a degree because of just clusters round the outside. And I'm familiar with that problem in Hertfordshire, which is all small market towns which keep accreting suburban car-dependent estates on the outside. And there was a very interesting exercise done by the University of Hertfordshire some years ago with a famous Cuban-American planner who just said, why are you destroying your historic towns? You should be taking the legacy of Ebenezer Howard and the new towns and putting a new town in Hertfordshire. And he recommended somewhere on the railway line between Hitchin and Royston, which would be on the railway line, commute to Cambridge, commute down to London, build it to the highest modern ecological standards, make it bus dependent, etc. So I think there is a real role for intelligent new towns, as we did after the war and as Ebenezer Howard did before. But I can't speak to the merits of that particular proposal because I just don't know the detail.
But I mean, really interesting responses.
It is,
Did I see a
yes.
hand? Well, two here then, yep. Rebecca? Got anything on there? Yes, please.
Well, thank you. Firstly, I just have to say that I don't have a vote in this election. But however, I am intrigued
Neither do I, as a member of the House of Lords. Actually.
But I do think it's important to contextualize this election, because every party has said that it's very important that you vote a specific way in this election. But also, these votes has to be contextualized under the structure of the current electoral system, which is first past the post system.
Yeah.
And that system comes with it certain drawbacks. And also, this is very important from a public mandate point of view, because it is this structure of electoral processes that gives the public mandate to specific parties or specific combination of parties. And of course, I think the Liberal Democrats will have more to say about this in this issue. And I'm just wondering, generally, what is your comments or your party's comments on this structure as it is currently, and what that does, its implications to this democracy and the voice of the people? Thank you.
Great question. I am going to go to Sandy first, because we know electoral reform's your thing.
I wear the scars on my back, as I say, because in 1983, 21,000 people voted for me and 19,000 people voted for a woman called Margaret Thatcher, and yet she won and I didn't. By the way, if the boundaries had been the same as St Albans is today, I would have won in 1983. And I'd have been an MP the same year as Charles Kennedy. But there we are. That is the first past the post system. I come from St Albans, and it's quite shocking in St Albans. 50 of the 56 local councillors are Liberal Democrat. I mean, it really is shocking. I feel so sorry for the Conservatives who don't have a single councillor, and I feel sorry for Labour who got one or two, and then there are some Greens. But I mean, it is something so profoundly wrong with a system which is so unrepresentative. And we really desperately need to grow up in this country and recognise that actually some form of proportional representation, we prefer multi-member constituencies with a single transferable vote, would actually lead to more stable government, more secure government, more long-term government, and one that reflects people's wishes.
Mm-hmm. Lee?
So the remarkable Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan was asked in the late 1990s what he thought of Roy Jenkins' report and proposals for AV Plus that came out in 1998. And he said, I'm opposed to them because the great benefit of first past the post is that they could get rid of me when they wanted to, and then they got rid of you, speaking to a Tory MP, when they wanted to. And if you want to get rid of my party at the next election, first past the post is your great friend. Because relatively small changes in votes will kick out Tory MPs anywhere where they currently have their seats. And that is, I think, the great benefit, personally, of first past the post. I support it. The Conservative position is to support it. That it gives clear outcomes, typically gives majoritarian outcomes, and that if you change your mind and the country changes their mind, then it's very easy to remove parties. the left-wing parties quite often say that they favour getting rid of first past the post, and usually it's because of partisan advantage. The Lib Dems would have many more MPs now, I'll hold my hands up and say it, if we had a PR system. But it's really a case of be careful what you wish for. Because in 2015, the Conservative Party plus UKIP got more than 50% of the vote in this country. So Nigel Farage would have been Deputy Prime Minister under a PR system, almost unavoidably. In Germany, the AfD have got dozens and dozens of seats, the most right-wing party that we've seen in Germany in decades, under a PR system. So yes, first past the post has its imperfections, and Sandy's been a victim of them, and the Lib Dems in St Albans currently benefit from them. But it comes with some tremendous benefits and guarantees too that have helped stabilise our politics over a great many years.
Thank you.
And of course, I personally have always been in favour of PR. It isn't my party's policy. However, we have, of course, got different electoral systems for different elections in the UK. And I approve of that for two reasons. One is I think it's fairer, but also for women, it has actually proved to be, it's how we ended up with 50% of the assembly in Wales was female. It's because you've then got a much greater control over who the candidates are and where they are on the list. Yeah. So I mean, I am in between these two, really.
There was another question just next door, and then we'll go to the back. And
thank you very much. I'm not British, so I've learned a lot through your presentations, but it's a question that might interest anybody. So the crisis in the standard of living across the West is everywhere, but for instance, the Anglo-Saxon countries are the ones lagging the most. For example, I'm from Canada. The OECD forecasts that we will be the Western countries whose GDP per capita would grow the least in the next 40 years, and the UK is next to us with Australia and New Zealand. The only country that is doing well, basically, is the US. And even the EU, they're not far ahead. So for instance, in 2013, the EU GDP per capita was 80% of what the US is, and now it's below 60%. So what can you cannot take positions for other countries, but what can UK do to make sure that the Western world, and the UK in particular, is not lagging behind? And well, do you see what I mean? How to reverse the tendency?
big question.
Ooh.
Glenys.
One of the things that, I'm not an economist. My degree was in politics at the LSE. But one of the observations that I have about why the United States has been making such progress is that actually they invest. They make sure that businesses can access finance easily, and that people are supported to grow their businesses. And it seems to me that's and that's what Biden has succeeded in doing, is growing their economy by investing and by supporting and by directly investing in areas of different parts of the economy as well. That's my observation. So it seems to me that has to be
Sandy?
the answer.
Well, I think GDP is a pretty dodgy measurement, actually.
That's awesome.
And by the way, when I was here at Cambridge, I actually went to lectures by James Mead, who was the man that invented it. And he came up with it, and there he was, and he was a brilliant lecturer, by the way. But there's something very peculiar about a method of measuring growth and success, that if you have a massive oil spill and therefore require lots of work, people clearing up all the pollution, that adds to your economic growth. Your partner dies and you have to employ a housekeeper and you pay them a wage, and that adds to economic growth. So there's an issue around that. And I think also we have to accept, if we're into a world of using less stuff, that we are going to slow down. And we aren't necessarily going to go on going at the same rate, because we can't. We can't go on absolutely tearing this planet apart because there are so many people consuming so much stuff. So we have to change the way that we look at life.
Lee.
It's a great question, and if I add an observation to it, it's that most of the West has struggled to really recover from the financial crisis. That 2008 becomes a tipping point for the UK, for basically, like you say, every country but the United States. Because there's a huge amount about the US economic and social model from which we would not want to learn. But then I think there are other things that we can try and learn. one of them I think is absolutely productivity. You know, we need to look at how we can be more innovative, how we can encourage businesses to invest, how we can try and make sure that we get more output for every person in this country. Because while sometimes it feels like that's sometimes people think productivity measures are basically job-culling measures. But of course, there was a time when the vast majority of people in this country worked in agriculture. And as we brought in the combine harvester, we didn't find mass unemployment, we found better jobs and better incomes. And I think so that laser-like focus on productivity has to be key. And if there's one useful thing for the UK, which has had particular challenges on productivity, I think there were some really interesting countries, like in Europe in particular, like Denmark and some of the Scandinavian countries, who've achieved remarkable things in terms of their GDP per capita that we can learn from.
Yeah, interesting. Rob.
Speaking of the United States, I'm kind of amazed to hear first past the post portrayed as a mechanism to get rid of bad politicians.
Yes.
When you sort of combine that with the peculiar nature of the Electoral College, I mean, that leads me to my question, actually, which is the ghost of politics future. The thing that scares me the most is the kind of appeal to the worst instincts of a democratic society. And frankly, that, in my opinion, is why Brexit happened. It wasn't because of the nonsense about democracy that was spouted, you know, in terms of liberating Britain from, you know, European. No, it wasn't. It was an appeal to the worst instincts of substantial parts of our public. And what we're seeing in the United States in a few months' time is going to be, God help us, not something similar, but we'll soon find out. My question is, what are the Tories going to do so as to avoid appealing to the worst instincts in our electoral body and for some kind of substantial, you know, oh God.
Electoral advantage.
Please,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
this is
yeah.
this explains the success of the Tories, in my opinion, of the last, well, at least since Brexit. That's why that happened. And I want to hear how you're going to not do that in future elections.
I'm interested in that too.
As you might imagine, I don't accept the premise of the question. And that's because I have fundamental belief in the sound judgment of the British people. We didn't end up in government by chance or by some evil conspiracy. We ended up in government because we won the most votes and we got the most MPs. That's because people backed us. And they backed us not for sinister or unfair or culture war reasons. They backed us because at the last election, we were the only party that said, you know, that vote that you had, that everyone said would really matter and that we'd respect, we're the only ones actually going to respect it. The other two parties said, actually, why don't you try voting again and then see whether or not you make the right decision next time. And I think that was fundamental to the 2019 election. And I think for me, that's basically why politics has sometimes become so toxic. You know, because of mistakes on all sides, of course. But fundamentally, the worst thing that I think happened to our politics was having a significant number of politicians say to voters, you made a mistake, try again after the Brexit vote. And I think that soured almost everything.
This is actually great questions. Thank you very much. And I'd like to sort of segue into something slightly different and more personal with you all. You know, you've all been very passionate and articulate, and you've taken things on the chin, and you're kind of up for the fight. But we all know that politics isn't easy. It can be a rough game. What I'd love to hear a little bit about is what got each of you into politics, how you've sort of survived and not, you know, exited politics. I mean, Lee.
Sure. Well, I might kick off with a confession as the Conservative spokesperson on the panel, which is that I come from a long line of socialists. So my dad was a lifelong member of the Labour Party. His dad learned his socialism in the dockyards in Birkenhead. And my nan used to preach the values of left-wing politics in a soap factory called Levers in Port Sunlight on the Wirral. And they all had pretty similar values, really, that fed into me as I was growing up. They were patriots. They believed in reducing inequality. And they believed in advancing the interests of the working class. And in truth, my values aren't all that dissimilar to what their values were. But as I was coming of age in politics, I saw the Labour Party that had been the party of Attlee, the party of Gateskill, the party of Wilson, become the party of Blair, the party of Corbyn, and the party of Starmer. And I saw a Labour Party that fundamentally walked away from its traditional values and the sort of values that I grew up with. And then I discovered a different party, the party that Disraeli made, the party that first gave working class men in this country the vote with the Second Reform Act, the party that Baldwin made when he made his pitch not to any section or faction or class, but to the interests of one nation, the party that Macmillan made, building 300,000 new council houses per year and focusing on a version of the market economy that was never allowed to forget the poor or the destitute or the unemployed. And yes, the party that Margaret Thatcher made, with right to buy and with privatisation, transferring capital and assets to people in families like mine who never imagined they would own their own home or be share owners. And so particularly when I was coming of age in politics, they were the sorts of things that were going around my mind, that the familial inheritance of values, the prospect of upsetting my dad by joining the Tory party, which I absolutely did, and which party I thought had the right values for me, had the right values for our country, and within which party I could make the most useful contribution and argue most for the things that I cared about and that I believe in.
Thank you very much. Sandy, you've stayed in politics despite social media,
I did take some
losing
time off.
elections, winning elections.
Yes, no,
Right.
I actually did take some time
Yeah.
off and went and made some money and then came back. And I do recommend I recommend the making some money bit, actually. It does help. Look, when I came to this place, you had to sit an entrance examination. And it was at the end of the winter term. It was at Christmas. And whether you succeeded or didn't, you still had 9 months before you could go to university. And my parents just said, we don't want to see you. You'll be wasting your time if you stay at home, go and do something. And so I wrote to various companies to see if I could get a job. And I ended up getting a job loading lorries in an aluminium factory in West Berlin, then West Berlin. Now, by the way, I'd never left home before. I was 18 years old. I'd never left home. I'd never been abroad. We did UK holidays in those days, no cheap foreign holidays. And so I got on this great black train called the Ost-West Express that went across Europe, and it was winter, in January, snowing, and went through the Iron, crossed into East Germany, the Iron Curtain. And people came onto the train, the soldiers came onto the train and stamped their boots with the snow, rifles over their back, and searched our luggage. And we trundled across East Germany and then across the Berlin Wall and into West Berlin. And there I was in this factory, and I was the only West European in a gang of Turks loading lorries, Gastarbeiter. And our boss was a Nazi, unashamed Nazi. She'd sworn an oath to Hitler on his birthday to fight to the death to save the fatherland. I asked what happened. She said it wasn't fair. They crept up behind me when I wasn't looking. And every day they found me a place to live in the American sector of Berlin, actually the red light district. And the factory was in the British sector. And to get there, you had to go through the Russian sector, i.e. it was on a train, and you went underground and went through empty stations with a soldier standing there and a spark in the tunnel, and you'd see a soldier from the spark in the tunnel. And you changed trains in the center and went up, and this station with a wall running down the middle, and one side going east to Moscow and the other side going west, and a soldier in the roof of the station with a gun ready to shoot anybody. And then you crossed the Berlin Wall proper. And that was my journey to and from work as an 18-year-old. And it made you think. And it made you think that old men, and they were all old men in those days, in Moscow, Paris, London, Washington, drew lines on a map. And you were one side or the other. And you could lie down and say, rape me, or you could actually think, I want to be part of that and try and make a difference. So I came to this place, not knowing what I was. And I joined all 3 political clubs because I knew that politics...
Typical liberal, that really.
Actually, it shows a willingness
Great
to learn.
education, I'd say, absolutely.
I went to all
absolutely.
3, and they were really incredible speakers in those days because it was a far different political world. There wasn't the same 24/7. So really top people came up to speak.
time,
And I heard them all, and the smallest and most disorganized were the Liberals, but they were the only ones who talked to these issues, who actually showed a sense of the importance of civil liberties, human rights, a sense of what it mattered to be European and not just narrow in your own borders, and actually thought differently. And that's why I joined, and I've stayed ever since.
Thank you. What got you into politics?
I come from a very big working class family in Yorkshire. My parents were communists. So I actually joined the Young Communist League when I was 15 years old. So I was on demonstrations against the bomb when I was 8. I mean, I belonged to something called the Socialist Sunday School, which was a Sunday school which was about, so in fact, if I really think about it, I can tell you what the 10 precepts were. So I come from sort of deep working class roots, and I mean, the memories and the things that made me a political activist are things like, I can remember my dad, who was a plumber, so we always were driven around in a van, picking a man up on a road driving back to Bradford, and telling us that this man had no work, and he was travelling back to Bradford from where he lived to see if he could get a job because he'd been thrown out of his job. And I was about 7 or 8 when that happened. And I can remember sitting on the stairs at home, listening to the discussions going on in the sitting room, where my parents were very active in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And they were talking about whether there was going to be a nuclear war because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I was about 9 or 10. Yep. And these are the things that create the memories that make you think about politics when you belong to so I regard myself as very privileged. I belong to a working class family. So when I went to the LSE, I had to leave the Young Communist League because my comprehensive school, my best friend, who was a year older than me, failed her 11 plus and went to a secondary modern school. And she was very clever, and she ended up in the RAF, and she was fine, but she should have done better. She should have done better. And we all knew that. We grew up knowing that. I was the first year of the comprehensive system in Bradford. And I was threatened with expulsion because I was a radical young communist and gave out leaflets and things. And the Communist Party said I had to leave the Young Communist League because my education was more important than political activity. And they were quite right. So I did, and I did my A-levels, and I went to the LSE, and I joined the Labour Party, which nearly got me disowned by my parents. But I've been in the Labour Party since 1974. So I decided I wanted to be in the party that mattered, the one that was going to win power, because that's where I thought we should effect the greatest change. And I've been there in the Labour Party since 1974, and I joined the Cooperative Party at the same time, because the other thing that I grew up believing in, and because my parents did, and they were all, I'm a 6th generation co-op person. It was important. In working class families, particularly in the north, you were a member of your cooperative society because you gained enough tickets to buy coats and things like that. So being a member of a cooperative is a very important thing as part of my life, and has been all the way through my politics. So that's why I was here talking about social enterprise and mutuals and so on, because actually that's what I think is one of the ways you transform.
So politics is different now. Social media, 24/7. Your advice to some of these young people who, let's hope, will go into politics and will join politics, just one nugget of advice.
I joined Twitter in 2011 because I was told to by the media people in the Labour Party, and I have never really regretted it, because I found that what that allowed me to do was to say what I do in the House of Lords. So I don't do it every day, but I regularly tweet from the front bench to say what amendments I'm putting forward on what bills, because I think that's actually quite important.
So make it work for you.
So you make it work for you.
Yeah. Okay, Sandy?
Well, first of all, vote. Can I say?
Yes, vote. Please vote.
I was taught by Graham Howes here, and I remember my astonishment. We were in a tutorial, in a supervision, and he said, I wonder, have any of you voted? And if so, could you tell me what it's like because I've never done it. And this was the man teaching us politics. Yes,
my
Graham,
God.
Graham said that, yes, to us. I remember. You know Graham, obviously. So anyway, now what I would say is obviously try, vote, get involved, connect, go and see if you can help, see who's turned you on, but then get some life experience. Actually, there are too many politicians who've just gone through the system and have gone through the research department or gone through the trade union or whatever, but just have never actually gone out and done a normal, if you can call it that, job where they're involved in teams and managing people. I mean, a lack of management experience, actually. A lot of them have never managed anybody, and then it really shows when they become ministers. And it's quite intriguing. My son's a civil servant. It's really intriguing to get his take on who are good ministers and who are not. And I can tell you, it's really surprising, quite surprising.
Lovely. Thank you very much. That's another top tip. Lee?
Well, for the most part, in fact, you've already done it by coming here tonight, because my key thing would probably be to just throw yourself into meeting the people who get involved and practice politics. Because quite often, you may have had it tonight listening to me, you'll sit there and look at them and think, gosh, that person's a total fool. They have extraordinary confidence, but they're an absolute, insert your own word.
Bonker.
Yes. And that quite often happens in politics. Some of the people with the most confidence in their abilities and who are keenest on their own voice actually have the least to offer. And I think sometimes the more you come along to political events, the more hopefully you get involved in politics. You'll sit there and think, actually, my idea is better than that. Or my experience says that that's not actually quite the case. Or I know people who would not agree with a single word that that person has said because this is more relevant to them, and that voice actually needs to be represented. And hopefully the experience of that will motivate you to be involved in politics and contribute to that sort of rich kaleidoscope of perspectives that political life really needs.
And if you're a woman, please get involved. Please.
Thank you all very, very much for sharing your personal stories. You are all great public servants. We may not agree with everything each of you has said on everything, but I think we can all support your commitment to being involved in political life in this country. And I too say vote, whatever you do.
Yeah, vote.
And thank you very much also for being, up for the battle about helping us think through what we might vote in the forthcoming election, those of us who have a vote. So thank you very much indeed.